I turn over to you right now, and please continue.
Yeah, so I'm not the first. Here it is, the FX6, to have played with this camera. I don't think I was the very first, but certainly I've had a play with it now. I had a period about 2 or 3 weeks ago where I had it for about 10 days and did a little shoot up in the Lake District with it, some filming around home, and a lot of very in-depth testing as well to really sort of learn as much as I could.
What was your first feeling with it when you had it in your hand?
Oh, immediately, it was everything I hoped it would be and a lot more. I've got an FS5, and in fact, that's what I'm currently filming myself with here, is the FS5. And that FS5, I mean, I've had it, what must be nearly 5 years now, has been a real workhorse camera for me. It's gone all over the world, it's gone up to the Arctic, it's gone down into Southeast Asia and the jungle, and it's been everywhere, and it's been a really useful small compact camera. So what I was hoping for was just something that was not too different from it, actually, because I really do like the FS5, but there were some limitations in the FS5, in particular with the recording codecs, that I was hoping wouldn't be there anymore. And then when I got the FX6, it was that and everything. So it's got the better codecs. The build quality is just superb. It's magnesium alloy. It's not any bigger. It's only fractionally lighter. And it's just everything I was hoping it would be, and then some. I mean, it's got a whole Cine EI mode and LUTs and everything else, which I wasn't really expecting. So, yeah, and then...
I'm really looking forward to hear more about it now. So I'll give you the full screen now.
Okay, right. So here we go. So I do have PowerPoint slides. I'm not going to bore you too much with them, hopefully. So do ask those questions, and I see we've already got one that's popped up, and I will answer that first question that's come in due course, because it is covered in my slides. So full frame 4K sensor, dual ISO. Now the dual ISO is slightly different to what we have in the FX9, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Over 14 stops of dynamic range, and again we'll look at that in more depth. XAVC-I class 300 codec, which is the same codec as the XAVC-I class 300 in the FX9, FS7, the very same codec. S Cinetone, Cine EI mode with LUTs, 4K 120 frames per second, or rather UHD to be precise, internal recording. Full frame variable ND filter, touchscreen operation, fast hybrid AF, 2 slots, CF Express Type A and SD compatible, 4 channels of audio, timecode in and out, and dual recording. Take a deep breath. And a modular design. So the hand grip, let me just release this from the tripod for a second. So the hand grip on the top comes off, undo these 2 knobs here and it comes off. The handle on the side here, that comes off as well, that's all removable. So very much like the FS5, a modular design, making a very small, very compact camera, and that's one of the things that I really like about this camera, is it's so immensely portable, take it anywhere, do anything. The LCD screen comes off. Oh yeah, at the front, that E-mount is not the locking one that you've got on the FX6. This is the normal bayonet mount, and the reason I really like that on this camera, now on my FX9, I'm really pleased that the FX9 has the locking mount. So when I was up in the Lake District in the UK, it's a very beautiful part of the country, I was shooting anamorphic with Cooke 2x anamorphic lenses using the FX9. Now the FX9 is really good for that because of its 6K sensor, the oversampling, because you have to manipulate the anamorphic a bit in post-production, so having that 6K oversampling really helps. But if anyone's shot with a Cooke anamorphic lens, you'll know that the lens is about that long, that diameter, and weighs, I'm guessing 2.5–3 kilos, some of them. They're really heavy lenses. So you need that locking, reinforced, heavy-duty mount to be able to support lenses that are that sort of size and weight. It would be crazy to put a Cooke anamorphic on this camera. The lens would be much bigger and heavier than the camera. But the problem with the locking mount is it does require two hands to change the lens. One to hold the camera, one to release the mount. But with this mount, with the bayonet mount, I can just single-handed, see if I can do it without dropping the lens, take the lens off. Now I do need to look at what I'm doing and put the lens back on. And as this is a camera that's going to be handheld, I think that's a big deal. So I think they've made the right choice to put the standard normal E-mount on this camera. Now the sensor, let's talk a little bit about the sensor. This is the same sensor, as far as I'm aware, as far as I can tell, as the A7S III. It's actually it's about 4.2K in full frame, recording 4K, UHD and HD. And because it's only got 4 or 4.2K of pixels on that full frame sensor, it is extremely sensitive, and I'll show you how sensitive it is in a little bit. We have this dual ISO function of 800 and 12,800, over 14 stops of dynamic range, and very, very low rolling shutter. It's less than 9 milliseconds. It really is very minimal. And we've got that Venice style color science, so it looks great out of the box. Now, in terms of dynamic range, did some very extensive testing. And this is at the low ISO, 800 ISO, and I've raised the brightness here so you can see this. There's lots and lots of different ways of measuring dynamic range. There really are. You can, the way Sony do it in the factory, and they've been doing this forever. So this is long before this particular chart that I've used here even existed, long before the software analysis tools that we have today existed, was to take middle grey against white and black, and then you underexpose the camera, and you keep underexposing until you can no longer see that middle grey against black, and you measure that point, and then you keep increasing the exposure until you can no longer see the middle grey against white, and that will give you the viewable dynamic range of the camera. And Sony have said it's more than 15 stops with this camera, and I have no reason to question that or doubt that, because if you look at this chart, I've raised the brightness of the blacks a bit here to make sure that you can see this clearly. We can see 15, if not 16 bars on that chart. So there are 15 plus visible stops of dynamic range. Now, some of the other tests, in particular the one that Cinema 5D or Cine-D do, they use a slightly different criteria, which is to do with the signal to noise ratio, SNR2, and they come up with a number that's lower, and that's not unusual. That's actually what you would expect, because there are different ways of doing this. They're all equally valid. When Sony do their test, the way they do it, they measure the dynamic range, and then they also measure the camera's noise, and you'll have two numbers, and you have a noise figure of something like 62 dB plus the 15 visible stops, and using those two numbers you can then work out your usable range and or what it's going to look like in underexposure and things like that. So they're just different ways of doing it, and they're all equally valid. I think most of the camera manufacturers do it the same way as Sony, because that's the way they've been doing it going back 30 years before all these tools that we have today came along. So they still stick with that way of doing it. So anyway, looking at this, so we can clearly see, you know, a really great dynamic range. This is the FX6 at 12,800 ISO. This is recording log. And again, we can see the same dynamic range. We can see the same number of bars on the chart. So, you know, in both ISOs, we actually have the same dynamic range, the same range, but there are some differences in the noise. Now, this is different actually to the way the FX9 behaves. So if we look at this slide here, if you look at the 12,800 ISO example, from stop sort of 8, 9, 10, 11, there's a lot of extra noise in the mid-range. Now, this is really unusual behavior. I haven't seen anything quite like this with any other camera. The noise floor, so that's the deepest, darkest noise in the deepest shadows, is actually broadly the same. So if you go down to the number 15 bar, and where the noise, where it's blending into the shadows, it's the same at 800 and at 12,800. There's not much difference. But from stop 7 to stop 13 at 12,800, there is more noise. Definitely, you can clearly see that there's more noise. So what does that mean in the real world in practical applications? What it means is you can use either ISO. If you can shoot at 12,800 and expose it nicely so that it's correctly exposed, it looks fantastic. But the 12,800 ISO, if it is underexposed, will fall apart quicker than the 800 ISO, if it was underexposed, would fall apart. Now, we do have to remember, of course, though, that this is the difference between 12,800 and 800 ISO is 16 times. So to get this very, very similar performance when you've made the camera 16 times more sensitive is really quite remarkable. And it's brilliant that you can shoot at 12,800 ISO in log and get a great picture. So we've got the camera here. So let's do a little bit of an experiment. We did test this shortly before we started, and I didn't break my neck or kill myself, so hopefully it will work this time round. So we have the output of the camera here. This is the output. It's live from the FX6, and we're currently in S Cinetone base ISO, and as you can see, it's lovely and light in the room that I have here. Now I'm going to disappear for a moment because I'm going to turn out the lights, so just bear with me while I do that. So let's see what happens as I turn out the lights. There's quite a few lights in here that I've got on, so we'll just turn everything off. Still got the computer on. One more light to turn off. There we go. And it's pretty dark in here now. If we look at the camera output. Sorry?
It's really dark.
It's really dark, isn't it? So this is no light at all, actually. This is not even candlelight. So we're looking at the output of the FX6 right now. So if I go into the quick menu here, I can change the base ISO to high and click set. So we're now at high base ISO, and you can just about now start to see the chart. And now let's try a bit of candlelight. Right. So, and I'm going to open the aperture up a little bit because we're at f4, 2.8 ISO, that's candlelight. It's still really, really dark in here. So this is the FS5 that you're looking at now, and then that is the FX6 by candlelight. And of course this is just the high base in S Cinetone. So when we're in S Cinetone, the high base is, I think the lowest you can go, yeah, is 5,000. Now let me go to the Cine EI mode. So
it's impressive, Alister, that the autofocus detects the faces.
Yes, yeah, exactly. The autofocus works as well. So let's just change into the from custom mode here to Cine EI mode, where we'll have that 12,000 ISO base. And I also need to, because the base ISOs are remembered for the different modes. There we go. So this is your 12,000 ISO base recording level. There's no extra gain or anything like that. We're at the base, and it's actually quite possibly slightly overexposed. There's my white card. Yeah, that's actually overexposed because the white card would be darker than that if I was exposed right. Close the aperture down a bit. That is insane, closing the aperture down to get a good exposure when you're shooting log just with a single candle lighting the entire scene. That is just crazy sensitivity. This FX6 is really quite remarkable. So just bear with me again. Sorry?
The sensor. It's really
Yeah,
the power of
it does. And of course we can go up. So this is Cine EI. So this is actually just raising the brightness of the lookup table. So let's just go, so it's changing my exposure index. So let's go back to the standard. Let me go back now to custom mode. Back to custom mode. Okay, so custom mode, we can change the ISO, and we can go up to 4.5. There we go, 409,600 ISO. That is an insane ISO. And as you can see, it's ridiculously overexposed. just with candlelight. And even at this ISO, so let me just expose it correctly. Where are we now? So it's F8, something like that. There is noise, but it isn't crazy. It's surprisingly good. I probably wouldn't myself choose. In fact, I'm not. I brought the ISO back down a bit, so that's the 4096. Personally, I feel that about the maximum you want to go before it really starts to get too grainy is about. It's going to be about 200,000 ISO, something in there. So what I'm really looking forward to, but unfortunately I can't do at the moment, is going to Norway, hopefully sometime over the winter. Oops, got the wrong setting there. I was just going to open the aperture back up to go and shoot the Northern Lights. So just bear with me while I turn the lights back on so we can see what we're doing. Right, so we're back to where we were, normal sort of light levels now. And actually, I tell you what, the FS5, just so you know, is actually 0 dB and it's at about f4. So that's where the FS5 was, just as a reference. Blow the candle out, and now we can, of course, come back down to our low base ISO, because we don't need that anymore, and stop down a little bit. So it's really sensitive. So I've got quite a few questions coming in. So yeah, the codec, the XABCI codec is the same as in the FS9. Somebody's asked about using it from your shoulder. Not really. The way it currently is laid out, it's very, very small. So if you were to try and put it on your shoulder, it would be back here. I mean, obviously you can buy shoulder rigs and you can buy cages and all that other stuff. So you could build it up to a shoulder mounted camera if that's what you wanted to do. And you'd probably then want to get an extension or something for the hand grip, because the hand grip would end up here, which isn't going to be very awkward. So you'd want it on some sort of arm or something like that to put it here. All of that's going to cost you some money though.
Is the hand grip the same connection as from the FS5?
Yes. Yeah, it's exactly the same. So the hand grip is the same hand grip as the FS5. It's completely the same, and it's plugged in with a little 2.5mm Lank jack.
Okay, so an extension arm for the FS5 will work.
Yeah.
With FX6.
Yes, it should indeed. But you also have under this little cover here the same. I don't know if you can see it. Not the easiest of things to see. The same multi-interface port as the FX9 has. So you can actually plug in two Lank devices at the same time. So you've got the multi-interface the same as the FX9, as well as the 2.5mm plug just here. So you have both, which is quite nice. You have both options. So you could build it up to a shoulder camera if you want to, but it's not really designed to be a shoulder camera. It really is designed more as a sort of a handheld, run and gun, run around with it type camera. So, yep. So what's the noise number on the FS5 and FS7? So I think the I'd have to, off the top of my head, I think the FS5 is about 54, if I remember right, and I think the FS7 is about 56, 57. The FS7 is a little bit noisier, a little bit quieter than the FS7. I would have to look that up and check that out. What is the image quality like in areas that the FS, like mixed lighting, skin tone, shadow noise, and highlight roll off? So image quality, yeah, I mean that's obviously one of the big things with this camera. Let me just skip forward through my slides. I've got some frame grabs in here. We'll get there in a minute. So in terms of mixed lighting and things like that, there's actually a really good frame here. So this is a frame grab from the FX9 with S-Cinetone, and it is under mixed lighting. So there's light coming in that's actually daylight from the right-hand side of the frame, and then you've got the lights that are in the room, which are just domestic LED lights. And it looks really nice just straight out of the camera. It's so easy to get a good image, and there's very little noise in the background. It's really quiet camera, and this is what I really like about it. It's just so easy to shoot with it because it doesn't seem to have any nasty traits. I mean, the FX9 is the same. The FX9 with this next generation of sensors that Sony have got really are a small step in so much as when people first look at the images, if it's been well lit, if everything is perfectly done, the difference between an F5, FS7 and an FX9 or an FX6 isn't vast. But if it's not good lighting, if you've got mixed color and everything like that, then the difference becomes much greater. The new sensor is much better in those sort of challenging and mixed sort of lighting conditions. So the FX6, will it handle anamorphic? You can. It doesn't have an anamorphic mode. You could put an anamorphic lens on it, but the problem you've got, because it's only a 4K sensor, and because with most normal anamorphic lenses, if you're talking about a normal 2x PL mount cinema lens like the Cooke 2x anamorphics, you've got to crop into the image. You've got to expand the image by 30% to fill the frame correctly. And because it's only a 4K sensor, 4K sampling, your recording resolution's about 3K, just over 3K. You crop into that, you're down to about 2.5K, something like that. So you will have slightly soft pictures. The FX6 is better for anamorphic because you've got 6K oversampling, recording an actual 4K resolution image. So when you do that crop, you end up at about 3.2K resolution, which is just as high as any other 4K camera can achieve. So yes, you can put an anamorphic lens on it. It doesn't have an anamorphic mode. You can record that, you can take it into post and you can manipulate it, but it wouldn't be my first choice of camera for it. It really wouldn't. It's not at all ideal. The FX9 is much better for that sort of thing, because you really do need that oversampling. Do I still need to overexpose the image when shooting log, or can I just rate it at the base sensitivity? You don't need to overexpose this camera when shooting log at all. And because it has the Cine EI mode now with lookup tables, shooting log with this camera is so much easier than shooting log with an FS5. Or an A7S3 even. And I think this is one of the really big things about it. So let's have a look at that Cine EI mode. We've got the camera here, so we may as well actually look at what we can do. So at the moment, let's start with S-Cinetone first of all. So this is S-Cinetone. Now, S-Cinetone was developed by Sony to give you good, rich images. Let me find the slide. So S-Cinetone is designed for great out-of-the-box images. It's designed for getting a really good look direct to air, as it were, without any grading. It's designed that it's designed to be simple. But S-Cinetone also, though, is quite different to ordinary Rec 709, and you need to adjust the way you expose a little bit when you use S-Cinetone. So we'll have a look. So the camera's currently in S-Cinetone, low base ISO, and a couple of things here. So I was doing another demo yesterday with the camera, so I've kind of changed a few things already. I'm just going to go into the menu and put my zebra levels back to the default settings. And you'll see why I'm going to in a moment. So let's just put this back to the defaults. So we have 70 and 100 is how the camera is supplied. And let me just turn the zebras on. Now, you won't see zebras at the moment because they're only in the viewfinder, but I'm going to turn the viewfinder around in a minute so you can see that. But this is S-Cinetone, and actually right now we're very slightly overexposed with S-Cinetone, in my opinion. Now, I do have, let me just remove the viewfinder. Let's see if we can make this work. I'm not sure whether you can see that. It's pretty small, but we do have zebras over the blonde girl's face. So if you were to expose your S-Cinetone like this, with zebras at 70% appearing over the blonde girl's face, I would suggest this is actually very slightly overexposed. And the reason I say that is this is actually the clever thing about S-Cinetone is that by changing the exposure, we can change how contrasty the picture is. So if I now lower my exposure, the contrast increases. If I go brighter, it gets flatter. So there is a point, and I think it's about there, where you get a really nice sort of much more sort of filmic look out of the camera, and it looks really nice. But now I don't have any zebras over the blonde girl. They've disappeared. So what I tend to find is I actually tend to adjust my zebras to 60%. And I'm going to do that. So let's just go into the main menu under my monitoring, and back down with zebras, and I'm going to turn the zebras down to 60%. Now you see the two orange lines over the waveform on the right hand side. Those are actually the zebra levels. The top one is zebra 2, which is currently at 100%, and the bottom one is zebra 1, which we've just set to 60%. And if I now turn the, just have a look at this, yeah, LCD screen around, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see it, but there are zebras over the blonde girl's face. So I prefer the way this looks. I really do think that if you expose it up here, which would be about 70%, it looks a bit overexposed, especially with fair-skinned people. They tend to really look quite pasty and quite washed out. But if we come down a bit so that we then have zebras at 60% over the face, which is there, and you can see the on the waveform, I don't know if it's going to, if I can do this, that, yeah, it's hard, I can't show it, but the little blob on the left side that's just touching that 60% orange line, that zebra 2 line, the zebra 1 line, that's the blonde girl's face, and we have zebras on her face, and I think that gives us a really nice exposure with S-Cinetone. If you want a bit flatter, then you can expose a bit brighter. It gets brighter, it also gets flatter. If you want it more contrasty, you can come down even further. But I think that sort of 60% works really well. Now, if we expose the skin tones here at 60%, the other interesting thing to look at is where does white end up? So I'm just going to introduce a white card for a minute. And what you'll actually find is that the white of a white card will actually end up at about 70% when your S-Cinetone is correctly exposed. So that line, that dotted line that this is now just going through, is 75%. And this is something that's really important to understand about S-Cinetone, is it is designed to be darker. If I was to try and expose my white at 90%, which is where you'd have it for 709, which is about there, then that really does look overexposed. It just doesn't look right anymore. So we really want to have that white at about 75%, 70-75%, somewhere down here. So we then get a better exposure on the skin tones with S-Cinetone. So that's sort of S-Cinetone. So I've been asked, which ISO is it better to switch from high to high from low? Say I need an ISO of 4000 to get a good exposure in a given situation. Should I use the low or high base? If you need 4000, well, it depends on the gamma curve for a start, because different gammas have different ISOs. So right now with S-Cinetone, if I see how far we can go way up. But really, so S-Cinetone is 5000 ISO in high base. I haven't extensively tested this, but I would suspect that as soon as you get to 4000 ISO in S-Cinetone, that's where you would switch up to high. You'd never use more gain than you need to. So And then in log, well, it's Cine EI, so it's a slightly different system. So basically in log, if you can't get a decent exposure at 800 ISO, you would switch up to 12,800 ISO straight away, because you only have really the two recording ISOs when you shoot log. So another question that's come in is there a Super 35 mode in the camera? And the answer to that is yes, there is, but it's only HD. So if you want to shoot with Super 35 lenses with this camera, you are really limited to HD, or there is a workaround, and that is because the camera has something called clear image zoom. So at the moment, what I'm doing is I'm just pressing the zoom rocker on the camera, and I'm able to zoom in and out by 1.5 times, a maximum of 1.5. Now, I'm not sure you'll see this in the zoom feed because the quality of the zoom feed is fairly low. I've experimented with this because another question people have been asking is, well, if I use a Super 35 lens, can I zoom in by 1.5 times on clear image zoom and use that instead? And the simple answer is actually yes, you can. So you could put a Super 35 lens on here, the camera's in 4K or UHD, zoom in by 1.5 times with clear image zoom, and it will work. You'll get a full frame image, but you do lose image quality. It's definitely not as sharp. It loses that sort of clarity that we have when we're not using clear image zoom. It's not terrible, it's not horrid, but it's just really not as nice as if you're not using the clear image zoom. So you are going to lose some image quality if you do that, but that would be the workaround, and it is very much a workaround. And the other thing that happens is when you zoom in with the clear image zoom is if you have got any noise or grain, it's much uglier noise and grain because you're expanding it. And at 1.5 times clear image zoom, effectively what you're doing is you're taking about a 3.2K Bayer signal, upscaling that to a 4K recording. So your final resolution is actually going to be around about 2.5K, something like that. So it's not a great way to do it. But at a push, if you've got no other choice, you could do it. Would I recommend that you do it? No, I wouldn't. If you want to shoot with Super 35, that's where you need the FX9, because the FX9 has a 6K sensor, which then can be used at Super 35 and delivers a 4K image. So that really is one of the key differences actually between this camera and the FX9. Dynamic range in S-Cinetone. So S-Cinetone dynamic range is about 11.5 stops. And you lose something off the highlights, basically. It's mostly a highlight loss. The way S-Cinetone rolls into the highlights is very pleasing, and it is very nice, but it is only about 11.5 stops compared to the 15 odd stops that is possible to capture in log. So, but that's the trade-off you pay. You can't really have 15 stops in a direct-to-air recording without it being ridiculously flat and not looking great. So S-Cinetone is designed to give you that great-looking image, but that does come with some trade-offs in dynamic range compared to log, and that's just really unavoidable. I think I've answered most of these. How does the FX6 work with a speed booster and EF lenses? Why would you don't want to do that? Speed booster is designed for Super 35. To use a full frame lens on a Super 35 sensor. If you were to put a full frame lens on this with a Super 35 sensor, you then got to use you can only record in HD if you put the camera in its Super 35 mode, and that completely defeats the object of having this camera, really. If you're desperately trying to shoot in some ridiculously low light level and you want to get the extra stop that the speed booster gives you, yeah, you can do it, but you're only recording in HD, so your noise is going to be a bit coarser and things like that. I wouldn't recommend it. If you want to use third-party lenses, then you just use an ordinary straight-through adapter to mount your lens rather than a speed booster.
Also, a comment there, Alister, regarding the metabone adapter or adapter. It makes a delay also when you're using the autofocus.
Well, yeah, I mean, the trouble with third-party lenses, this is so hard to really quantify because I really the only thing I can actually recommend is that people use Sony lenses. And the reason why I say that's the only thing I can recommend is because I know that you could go to your store, to Scandinavian Photo, put any Sony E-mount lens on this camera, and the autofocus will work as expected. You'll have minimal breathing, very little focus shift and everything else, and it's going to work. It'll be fast and it won't be noisy. There won't be any problems or issues. If you're using a third-party lens, yes, some of them do work well. Some of them don't work at all. It depends on the combination of lens and adapter. Let's take Sigma and their own MC11 adapter. There are some Sigma lenses with the MC11 adapter that don't actually work particularly well on the E-mount, and then you put a Metabones adapter and that lens works well. Or then you might have some Tamron lenses as well, or some other brand, and they won't work at all with the MC11. So a lot of Canon lenses won't work with the MC11 but will work with the Metabones adapter. So if you've got a mix of different lenses, you end up needing different adapters, because different adapters work differently with different lenses, and you need to also make sure, test each lens to see how it's going to perform. So because I don't know of all the third-party lenses and adapter combinations that are out there, because there are hundreds and thousands of combinations, which will work and which won't, I can't really recommend third-party lenses and adapters. All I can say is some work, some don't. You need to try it for yourself. When they work, they can work really well. When they don't work, they might not work at all. And it's not even consistent within brands. So within Sigma lenses, as an example, with Sigma's own adapter, the MC11, the Sigma 20mm doesn't really work at all. And then the 24-70 works reasonably well. But although the autofocus appears to often work with third-party lenses, what you'll often see is, because they tend to breathe quite a bit, is you might see a nicely focused foreground but hunting in the background, and that seems to be quite a common trait sometimes, where the focus will lock onto the foreground subject, but you get this slight pulsating action in the background. So if you're considering using third-party lenses with the camera, I don't want to put you off using third-party lenses, because a lot of them do work quite well. Is you do need to test the lenses that you are thinking of for yourself and evaluate it, because there's so many combinations. I think one of the few that I do know as being a valid combination is the Tamron 28-70. That does work pretty well as an option. But there's so many choices, so many options. I'm reluctant to give a recommendation for third-party lenses. Whereas a Sony lens, it's going to work. And one of the other things you get with the Sony lens is, so if I go to the camera, so right now, we're using the camera set up with the face operation. If I bring my hand in, actually I need to check, let me just see, so I've got face only and I'm a little bit overexposed at the moment. Let me just sort my exposure out. And let me see how my autofocus is currently set, because I have been fiddling around with the camera. So if I go to my shooting settings, the autofocus settings are here. So I have face eye priority at the moment, and wide area, and I'm just going to put this to fast and responsive. So let's just start off with the settings like this. So if I bring my hand in now, it's overexposed so it doesn't like it. Okay, come on camera, behave for me. Why is my autofocus not working? Okay, so it is working, but not terribly well. It's because I got face priority, that's why. So of course, while the camera can see faces, it will focus on faces. As soon as I obstruct all the faces, it's going to expose on my hand. And we can see how quickly and responsive the autofocus is. And this is the Sony 24-70 G Master. And that just works exceptionally well. So that's focus. Now, if we look at the settings that we've got, So we've got the transition speed. So if I slow that down, it's still going to change the focus, but it does it much more slowly. So that's transition speed. So it still responds instantly. As soon as I move my hand away, the focus is changing, but it's changing much more slowly. So that's your transition speed, which we can program and is highly adaptable. And let's go back into here. So let's put that reasonably fast, so we can actually, let's just put it back to fast. Now let's look at responsiveness. So if I'm not going to put it into locked on. I'm going to go down here to number 2. So this will now slow down how quickly the camera responds. So if I bring my hand through the shot fairly slowly, nothing's going to happen, because I have the cameras, basically I've told the camera, don't respond quickly, don't respond instantly. So if you were filming somebody the other side of the street and there's traffic passing through the shot or people walking through the shot, it's really not going to affect how the camera behaves. But if I hold my hand here for long enough, eventually it says, right, okay, that's been there long enough, and I'll change. Same if I take it away. So we can change how responsive the camera is, and we can also change how quickly it changes focus. Now typically I end up using the shift sensitivity, that's the responsiveness, at about 3, and I'll normally have this at about 4. So I get a fairly natural looking autofocus. So it doesn't take that long to realize the focus needs to change. And then when it does change, it does so in a fairly slow manner. Now I'm using the face focus at the moment. So one of the things I can do with, oops, didn't want that, press the wrong button on the camera, is we can choose faces. So I've got a thumbstick. I'm using the little joystick that's on the hand grip of the camera to move this orange cursor, and I can pick which face the camera is prioritizing. Now when we get a double box, so you can see that we now have a double box around the blonde girl's eye. That double box, and the fact that it's white, is telling me that that's the face that's being prioritized. So if I move my cursor to this girl here and I press select, we'll get a double box, and then when it goes white, that means it's been focused. And what that now means is in face priority now, if I obstruct her face, because the camera can't see her face, it will focus on another face. But as soon as the camera sees her face again, it will come back to there. That's a really useful mode. But we do have an alternative mode, and you can set these up actually on the assignable buttons, so you can change these a bit more quickly, but I'm doing it in the menu. So if we go, actually I'll show you another way of doing this. So we have something in the camera called direct menu. So I press there's a direct menu button on the hand grip, I'm pressing that, and this brings up direct menu, and I can now go through all these different functions here, and I can go up to my autofocus here, and I can choose face eye only. So I don't have to go into the menus, I can do this using what's called direct menu. And this is face eye only. Now in this mode, the camera will only focus on faces, and because we've told the camera to only focus on the girl who is now currently focused on with the double box, when I obstruct her now, the focus won't change. It won't shift, it won't focus on anything else. It will only ever, if you look at the other girls' faces, they've got grey boxes around them, so the camera isn't focusing on them. It's only ever going to focus on her, no matter what I do. Now, one of the things you can do with a Sony lens is I can now override the focus. So I can now turn the focus ring on the lens, so I've just turned the focus ring on the lens to override the focus. Because we're in face only, and we've told the camera the only face I'm ever interested in is that other girl, it's ignoring everything else, and I now have complete manual control over my focus. I haven't had to press any buttons, I'm just turning the focus ring on the lens, and that's something that doesn't actually work like that with third-party lenses. Now as soon as I release her, now it might not, because she's so out of focus, it's not going to go back to her. I'm going to have to bring her a little bit more into focus so the camera can see her face, and it should, and it's let me down. The beauty of a live demo, it should have gone back to her face, but for some reason it's not recognizing her face. Now this is a problem. I do get this sometimes with this because it is a picture, because it's not a real person. The camera does tend to work much better when you have an actual face. Let's just select the blonde girl instead. So I know with her we can block her. I can go to manual focus, and then when we come back, bring it back into focus a little bit. It's interesting. So this is slightly different. I haven't actually tried this. This is slightly different behavior to what I see normally with the FX9. And I think it's something that I haven't noticed before. Is it if I use the AF override, it seems to lose the face memory. Okay, and so I've learned something new about this camera. So much to learn about this camera. That was there you go. The interesting things happen when you do things live. Right, other questions that are coming in. So catalyst browse and gyro stabilization. So yes, I really actually like this as a function. So the camera has sensors in it that detect how it's moving, whether it's going up, down, left or right. And in fact, I think it's on at the moment. You'll see at the bottom, actually, just below the waveform, there's a little indication that's telling me that my tripod isn't quite level. So it's just gone green. There you go, camera's level. So it's actually my chart that's not level. So we have sensors within the camera that detect the orientation of the camera and how it's moving. So they are gyroscopic. They're electronic, but they're like a gyroscope type detector. That is recorded alongside the internal clips, and provided you are not using, and that's very important, provided you've turned off image stabilization in the camera, so you do need to go into the menus. Or in fact, actually I can do this again. It's something I can do with quick menu. We can actually see. So I press the little menu button on the side of the camera, and then I can come down to stabilization. We can currently see it's off. So because this lens doesn't have stabilization, but you can use direct menu to turn it on and off right here, just by highlighting that. Don't need to actually go into the main menus. With stabilization, with optical stabilization turned off, you can then take your clips into Catalyst Browse and stabilize them. Now, some people have commented about this camera not having IBIS. So the A7S Mark III has IBIS, in-body stabilization. Now, one of the things with IBIS is the sensor has to be very, very light to do that, to move the sensor fast enough to stabilize the shot. The sensor in this camera is held at a constant temperature so that you can shoot all day long without ever having any thermal or temperature issues. And by having the same temperature for the sensor, the noise stays constant all the time. And that helps you get better image quality. But that requires a heat sink on the sensor and things like that. So the sensor's then too heavy for an IBIS system to work. So instead we have this metadata stabilization. And the beauty of the metadata stabilization is you can adjust it. So I can take my clip into Catalyst Browse and I can have more or less stabilization depending on what I want. And it really is incredibly effective. It really does make a tremendous difference. And if you turn it up high, yes, it does crop into the image a bit. You can make the image look very floaty, almost like it's on a gimbal. And if you just have a very minimum amount, you can use it just to take out a bit of handheld camera wobble. And that for me is the big thing, is it's adjustable in post. And hopefully eventually this will be implemented in other edit software and other edit applications. Now there is a big update to Catalyst Browse due out very, very soon, because the other thing that this camera now supports in metadata is two other things actually. Is one that's related to the position sensors, is that you can shoot portrait with the camera. So it's normally landscape, but you can turn the camera on its side and shoot portrait, and then when you take your footage into Catalyst Browse, it's played back in portrait correctly. So the camera remembers which way up it is, 90, 180, 270 degrees, so that the clips play the right way up in Catalyst Browse. And that's a really neat little feature. So you can now shoot portrait with this camera. And then the other thing is now we have this extra button just up here on the top of the camera that's got a little flag symbol on it. And we can use that button, if I go into the main menus. I've got to think where this is now. I think it's in project. Where is it? I know I've seen it somewhere, but you can determine whether this button marks your clips as being good or bad. Where is it? And if it's not there, I need to find out where it is. So much to learn about this camera still. But this button, if I'm recording or if I've just finished a clip, let me record a clip. Or while I'm recording, I can press the button and we can mark the clip as, in this case, OK. And using this button, we can add these markers to the clips that you can then sort your clips when you're in thumbnail mode in the camera or in Catalyst Browse, and you can mark them as being OK, keep, or no good. And that really does speed up sorting through footage and clips in post-production. Battery life compared to the FX9. So this camera requires 18 watts and the FX9 is 35 watts. So that means that a BPU 35 in this camera, that's the battery that's supplied with the camera, that's the small one, don't think I've got one here, that'll run the camera for over 90 minutes, somewhere between 90 minutes and 2 hours, depending on how fresh the battery is. A BPU 60, which is, where's BPU 60? BPU 60, one of those. If you put one of those in the camera, that will give you to be around about 2.5 hours, something like that, maybe even 3 on a good day with a fresh battery. This one doesn't. This battery I've just discovered, looking at it earlier, this battery is actually 12 years old. And even this 12-year-old Sony BPU will actually still run this camera for a good hour, almost 2 hours still. So most people probably would want, I'm going to say 3 of these for a day's shooting, or you can use third-party ones. Of course, I've got to say use Sony ones, they are the best. But three of this size of battery will normally be plenty for a day of shooting. So it requires about half the power of the FX9, so it's pretty good. But that is more than the FS5. So the FS5, if I remember right, was about 12 watts or something like this. Is 18. And this is actually very similar to the FS7. So the FS7 uses about the same amount of power as this one does. Yeah, we'll come on to the log workflow. I will come back to that in a minute. How quick is the camera to switch between different frame rates? Right, it's really quick most of the time to switch between different frame rates. So right now we are at 24p or 23.98. If I want to use S&Q, I can just press the S&Q button. We go into S&Q. And if I want to change that frame rate, I can just press and hold the S&Q button, and I can go to 120 frames per second and press go, and we're done. So basically the only time the camera needs to reboot is when the camera's changing between the base frame rates. So if you change between let's say 23.98 and 25p, or if you change between 25p and 30p, then the camera will reboot. But the camera only takes a complete reboot once you've selected the frame rate is about 2.5 seconds. It's really fast. When you turn the camera on, it takes it about, it's fully booted and ready to shoot. Well, it's actually ready to shoot in about 2 seconds. You can actually be in record after about 2 seconds, but all the displays, all the stuff on the LCD don't come up until about 2.5, almost 3 seconds. So it's very, very fast, even if it does have to reboot. You're not waiting ages. But certainly things like going in and out of S&Q and things like that, very quick, really, really fast. Now, one thing that is interesting, so autofocus, we're at 120 frames per second. So right now it's 120 frames per second, and we still have all the autofocus functions. It's slightly less responsive. We're in face only. Let me come out of face only. Let's go back to face priority. We still get all our autofocus at 120 frames per second. And all works nicely. But if I go to 100 frames per second, you'll see it now says MF only, manual focus only. We don't have autofocus. So autofocus only works at nice, neat, round multiples of the base frame rate. So if the camera was set to 25p, the autofocus will work at 100 frames per second, but it won't work at 120 frames per second. When you're set at 30p, the autofocus will work at 120 frames per second, but not at 100 frames per second. It's a slight odd quirk of the camera. I'm sure it's to do with the way the camera has to get from the recording frame rate to actually being able to process that. So it's one thing, right now, 100 frames per second, you can't actually show evenly at 23.98p. There's probably going to be some slightly odd motion artifacts if I do that. And I'm sure that's part of the reason why that is. Let's come out of S&Q, go back to normal frame rates. And one of the things I do need to go back to a sensible shutter speed now. Okay, so it's really good in that regard. It's really great at changing frame rates. Can you use a iPhone, iPad, Android phone, Android tablet as a monitor? Yes, you can. So the camera does have Wi-Fi, and like the FX9, you can use Content Browser Mobile to view what the camera is recording on your mobile device. So yes, absolutely. The camera doesn't stream, but it does connect to Content Browser Mobile, and it does have FTP functionality too, so you can upload files to a remote server via FTP. Now I'm going to go back to the camera, and we're going to go to that Cine EI mode and show you how that works, because there's a couple of people asking about that. So one short press of the menu button brings up this sort of quick menu, as it were, and there's all sorts of things in here. Your audio controls are in here, so if I want to change my channel 3 audio, I can do it this way. This is all happening via touch screen, so I'm just tapping the screen to change these things, not using the menus. So to go into the Cine EI mode, I go to my project settings here, just tap the screen, Cine EI set. Okay, so we're now in Cine EI, just single press of the menu button, and actually because we were fiddling around with this earlier, we're still at 12,800 high base ISO. So let's just go back to that. That's on page 1. So just tapping the screen, 800, set. Okay. So we're now in the Cine EI mode. It looks overexposed because we're at 800 EI. So we've just gone from 320 ISO to 800 EI. So the camera has become more sensitive. So we'll just stop down a bit. Now I've currently chosen the 709-800 LUT. So I'm using LUTs at the moment. Let's have a look at the LUT options. Page 5 for the LUT options. So I'm outputting SDI at my SDI output is currently HD. Now I could set this to UHD, but if I do that, you'll lose the output. You won't be able to see this output anymore because my Vision Mixer only allows me to have 1080p. But you can output 4K or UHD. My LUTs, I can turn them on and off for the SDI out. So I've just turned them off. So now we're looking at the S-Logs 3 on the SDI out. I can turn them back on for the SDI out. I can turn them on and off for the viewfinder. Obviously, you're not going to see a difference because that's just in the viewfinder. These two controls for the SDI out and the viewfinder out are completely independent, and the LUTs work whether you're in HD or UHD or 4K, outputting HD. I've yet to find an instance where they don't work the way you want them to. We can down here choose different LUTs. So the default LUT is S709. This is the same LUT that the Sony Venice camera has. But I'm going to come back to that LUT in a moment. I'm going to start off with 709-800. Things are a little bit easier to understand with this LUT, I feel. Now, let me just find a PowerPoint slide, because there's a PowerPoint slide that illustrates something here that's easier for me to show you on the PowerPoint slide. There we go. So the waveform display, and on that side of the screen, that first top indication, SG3, S-Log3, that is what's being recorded. Then below that is what's being seen in the viewfinder. The LUT 709-800 is shown here. And then we have just above the waveform what the waveform display is measuring. So that's what those three indications are. So you can see on the camera right now, we're recording S-Log3. We have the 709-800 LUT in the viewfinder, and we have the 709-800 LUT on the SDI out, and that is then what the waveform is measuring. Now our correct exposure for 709-800, this is ordinary plain vanilla Rec 709, for a white card would be 90%. So I'm going to make use of these zebra markers again. So I'm just going to go into the main menu, and if I go to my monitoring settings, zebra, I'm going to set zebra level 2 to 90%. So I now have two lines on the waveform. I've got 60%, because that's where we set the zebras earlier, was 60% for zebra 1 and 90% for zebra 2. Now the correct exposure for white is, with ordinary 709, is 90%. So making sure this is in the light, my white card, 90%, and that's going to be the correct exposure for 709-800, because this is ordinary Rec 709. And then in terms of zebras, well, I have zebras over, or well, actually I don't have a lot of zebras, to be honest. I've got zebras over the white in the screen. Right, so now let's turn the LUT off. So I'm going to turn the LUT on the HDMI and SDI off, so that now we're looking at the S-Log3, and of course that is what the waveform is measuring. So if I introduce my white card now, you'll see it passes through that 60% line, because that's the correct exposure for log, whereas 61% would be the correct exposure. So by putting your zebras to 90% and 61 would be a bit more accurate perhaps, you can use them for S-Cinetone, you can use them for Rec 709, you can use them for all sorts of things to make sure your exposure is correct. Let's just put the LUT back on again. So this is, there we go, the white card going through the 90% line, correctly exposed. S709-800 is really easy to work with. Now the nice thing about 709-800 is if I now go up in exposure, sorry, down, up in exposure, it very quickly, within a stop, looks overexposed. We can clearly see it's overexposed. And then if we go down a stop, it starts to look excessively dark very quickly. So actually just looking in the viewfinder image is pretty clear when it's correctly exposed, because it just looks right. Now let's change that LUT. Oh, no, we'll leave it on. Change that LUT to S709. This is the default LUT in the camera. So this is now S709, and it looks a bit flat. We're still looking at the LUT, and that's because S709 is designed as a starting point for grading. S709 isn't really meant to ever be your final look. S709 is meant to be, this is your starting point for grading, add the S709 LUT in post, and then grade to get your finished look, and that's what it's really meant for. Now when we're doing this, if I introduce a white card again, so we're looking at the LUT, and we know this is correctly exposed because if I turn the LUT off and we look at the log again, nothing's changed. My white card is still just above that, that 60% line, 61%. So we're still correctly exposed. Now let's bring the LUT back on again. And my white is now actually, it's about, I think it's that dotted line on the waveform that you can just about see is 75%. So the white is actually about 80% with S709. This is a different level again, and your skin tones actually once again end up at about 60%. So if I turn the zebras on in the viewfinder, I actually have zebras across, right the way across the blonde girl's face. Let me show you that. See if we can don't know if you can see, come on camera focus. So we've got zebras well and truly covering the blonde girl's face. So S709, you have to be a little bit more careful with how you expose, because it is designed, it should look that little bit darker, and it should look that little bit more flat, washed out. I just find with S709 it a little bit difficult if I'm just looking at the image in the viewfinder to be sure when I'm correctly exposed, because it doesn't change much. Because it's a flatter image, it just doesn't change as much. So it becomes harder to understand when you're overexposed. If we go back to the 709-800 LUT, I think it's pretty clear that that looks overexposed. It's very obvious. So I still actually use, when I'm shooting log very often, this lookup table, because I still find it easier to work with. Now, part of this Cine EI, so we've got exposure index, so I can check. I've got a couple of ways. I can use the high, low, mid button to change the exposure index. Now, this is currently set to some quite odd settings. Somebody else has been playing with the camera before me. Or I can press the ISO gain button and change the exposure index. Now with FS7, I would have perhaps suggested use 400 or maybe even 200. If we go to 200 to demonstrate this a bit better, the picture in the viewfinder gets darker, and then because you have a darker picture in the viewfinder, you might bring your exposure up so that it looks right again, and that should, where's my white? There you go, see my white is at 90% again. And now though, if we look at what the S-Log recording is doing by turning the LUT off, my white now is way, way up there. It's almost 90, it's about 83%, something like that, 85%. We're exposing much, much brighter. And the reason that you would have done this with the FS7, FS5 as well really, is to get less noise. The more light that you put on the sensor, the more light we have going through the lens and onto the sensor, the brighter the actual recording is. So when you go into post-production and you bring the levels down, you get less noise. But because this camera has so much less noise anyway, you really don't need to do this. You can just leave the camera set to 800 EI, like that, and then just expose so that it looks okay in the viewfinder. Let's turn that LUT back on. You just expose so that it looks okay in the viewfinder, and you're going to be good. You're going to be absolutely fine, and that's just going to work. There is so little noise in this camera that yeah, and the FX9 is the same. There is no longer a need to add in that exposure offset. I mean, if you're shooting somewhere and you don't have big bright highlights and things like that, then use 400 EI. You'll have even less noise in post and more shadow range. So yes, do still use the lower EIs if you want to get a bigger shadow range in particular, but you will give up some highlights. I wouldn't ever really recommend going to a higher EI like 1600 or anything like that, because that will tend to make the pictures noisy. But you don't need to worry about offsetting the exposure with this camera. There just really isn't any need to do that anymore. Yeah, I think I've answered those. Is it possible to import custom LUTs? Absolutely, yes it is. One of the great things about this camera. One of the quirks of doing it though is you have to put the, so let's go through it. SD card, either SD or a CF Express Type A, put it in the lower slot of the camera, the bottom slot. Then we go into, so I'm getting a not guaranteed media message. I'll explain that in a moment. So we go to our lower slot and then go to my media, format the media, which is in A. And you can do either the quick format or the full format. I'm just doing a quick format here. So quick format, I haven't tested this yet, but my understanding is quick format just deletes the files that are on the card, whereas a full format erases the card and it can never be recovered. So we've done the quick format. And what that will have done now, by putting this card in slot B, and formatting it is it will have created the correct folder structure for the LUTs. And if you look at the card, you'll see it. It's fairly obvious. You'll see that there's a folder in amongst all the folders for your LUTs, and that's where you put them. And then you can load a LUT from the SD card into the camera, a 3D cube LUT, a 33 times 3D cube LUT, and you can load your own LUTs into the camera. There's this really great camera in that regard. So another question is, does it match the FX9? Absolutely. Let me find an example somewhere. Should be an example in here. I can't remember exactly where it is. In amongst all of these PowerPoint slides. Oops, hang on a minute. So does it match the FX9? Yes, it does. So this is FX6 on the left, FX9 on the right. They're not identical, but they are probably, of all of the cameras, so FS7 and FS5, even though they're the same sensor, they don't quite match. They're actually a little way apart, those two cameras. F5 and F55 don't quite match because they're different sensors again. But this is one of the closest matches I've ever seen between two cameras with two different sensors. In terms of would you need to change this in post-production and do anything, I don't think you would. I really do think you can use an FX9 and an FX6 side by side and the two will cut together almost perfectly. If you look at the mannequin, the model head on the right hand side of the frame, you'll see that there is a very subtle difference there. Now, whether that was just because these were slightly different times of the day and there was some light coming in through a window somewhere, I don't think it is. I think that is where the cameras are very, very slightly different. But to get this match, where if you want them to look so similar, you do need to use the push white balance here on the camera, because the preset white balances are very slightly different between the two cameras. I think those that have got the FX9 will know that it can sometimes trend towards green a little bit, but if you use the push auto white balance on the FX9, all of that goes away, and if you use push auto white balance on this camera, you'll get a really good white balance, and both cameras will be the same, and then you will be able to use the two cameras side by side on a shoot and cut between the two, and the audience, the viewer, will never notice. They really won't. You're not going to have to go into post-production and grade or anything like that to make them match. So it really is nice that the two cameras match, and I think for me that's one of the big things about this camera, because I've got an FX9 and I love my FX9. It's a brilliant camera. I have no intention of getting rid of my FX9 because I still use a lot of Super 35 lenses, in particular cinema PL mount lenses. So I need that 6K sensor with the 4K Super 35 mode. But I see this as being a really good companion camera to the FX9. And there'll be some times where I might use this camera and some times where I might use the FX9, and some shoots where I'll use both. And I'm not at all concerned about cutting between them or using both cameras on the same project or same shoot, whether that's in S-Cinetone or whether that's in log. Now, if you're going outside of S-Cinetone and log, if you want to use things like 709, there are some differences. So this doesn't have hypergammas, and there are some differences there. And in fact, I just posted on my website a list of differences between the two cameras that's actually quite extensive. There's quite a few things that are different, but in terms of being able to use both cameras together on the same shoot or same project, no, it's not a problem. It's something that you absolutely can do. So that's a really great thing. Just checking. I think I've answered all the questions that have come in so far. Do keep those questions coming in if you've got any more, because we're sort of coming towards the end of the things that I wanted to discuss with you with the camera. I will show you a little video though, so let's just have a look at a video. So just bear with me a second, and hopefully this will all work. Let me just cue this up. So this was shot with a pre-production FX6, and what I wanted to do with this video was to not actually go out and make something amazing, incredible, to spend hours lighting it and to be really fussy over how I set the camera up and things like that. I wanted to sort of really sort of give you an idea of this is what happens when you open your box, you put a battery on the back of the camera and you shoot with it. This is what it looks like. So I did use Cine EI, so I did take it into Resolve, and I didn't really grade it. I just put the 709 LUT on it and just tweaked the contrast here and there, because that's the way that S709 LUT's designed to work. So I haven't spent ages and used hundreds of different nodes and done all sorts of fancy stuff to make this look special. It really is, this is something that anybody can achieve with the FX6 just by shooting with it, exposing it, using the built-in LUTs, and this is what you'll get. So the shots mainly are of, I'll run the video. It's just, so this is my wife making PPE for local hospitals. We have a group of people here that are making protective equipment for hospitals, surgical gowns, face masks and things like that. So we've got some 4K 120 using autofocus. So this is all autofocus. And the skin tones just look nice. It just looks lovely without having to do anything with it. And I think this is where this camera is really strong. And this is mixed lighting. So the sewing machine itself has a little LED light on the back of it. There's light coming in from the window, which is right of frame. There you can see the window there. And there are LED lights in the ceiling of the room. So this is hardly good lighting conditions. But with no effort, I think it looks pretty good. I think it looks, really nice. And the sewing machine is I think that sewing machine is something like 60 years old. But she's made thousands of these things with this machine. It's a sort of semi-professional machine. This is some time lapse. The camera has interval record built in, 120 frames per second again. The way it captures the colors of the trees and everything else is absolutely fabulous. Huge dynamic range. This is the sort of the 15 stops of the camera really doing its thing. This is just a walk in the local park. We're just taking the dogs for a walk. We have a couple of dogs, and the light coming through the trees just looked nice, and the camera just looks nice. And this is all shot with the 24-70 G Master. All autofocus, and it's really easy. And that's what you want from a camera. You want a camera that you can just pick up and get shots that look like that with ease. You don't want stuff that's difficult. And I think when the FX6 came out, that was one of the real things that surprised me with the FX6, was how easy it was to get really great pictures. With the FS7, FS5, you had to think about it a lot. You had to be really careful with how you exposed. You really had to really be concentrating on what you were doing. But with the FX9, with its bigger dynamic range, S-Cinetone, and lower noise and everything else, it suddenly became so much easier. And this is the same. We have all those same characteristics, those same traits as the FX9, less noise, bigger dynamic range, and now we have LUTs in this small camera. It just makes it so much easier to work with. So highlight fringing on the FX9, well, yeah, but most of that's chromatic aberration. This camera, yeah, if you put a lens that's got chromatic aberration on it, yes, you get green fringing. 90% of the green fringing issue, 95% of it on the FX9 is lenses with chromatic aberration shooting in an extremely high contrast situation that puts an immense amount of green light right on that edge, and yes, you're going to overload the sensor. I haven't pushed this to its limits to see if it does it too, because I don't shoot that way. I use my viewfinder to see what I'm looking at. So, and the other thing is, what Sony have discovered is, this comes back to the white balance on the FX9. The FX9 trends towards green on the white balance. If you use the push auto white balance, that problem goes away. Or if you add in is it a plus, I think it's a minus 10 green tint on the FX9, that problem goes away. So a lot of it's a combination of white balance and a combination of lenses with chromatic aberration. That fringing problem, almost every single sensor that's out there is affected by it. It is not at all a unique thing to the FX6. And I wouldn't be surprised if we get something similar with this if you push it to its limits. You've got a Bayer sensor. You have to understand that Bayer sensors, there isn't it's not fully color sampling every single bit of the image. You know, the image that you're looking at of me right now has holes in it where there aren't colors, and in the de-Bayer process the camera has to guess, or the process guesses what color goes there, and if you overload one color channel, that's going to affect that process, and that's why you get these image artifacts, and it occurs with almost all Bayer sensors. And is there any log and cinetone footage to look at? Well, the video that I just shot, that you've just seen, was shot mostly, I think almost all of it is S-Log3 and graded. So that is that. I haven't got anything though to download at the moment. The files just tend to be too big. The problem with it's not worth sharing log footage with somebody if it isn't the original clip, because as soon as you encode it into a smaller file to make it smaller, you can't tell how that grades. It's got to be the original format. So at the moment, no, there's nothing out there that's downloadable. I'll see if I can find somewhere to arrange that, but I know when I've done it in the past and I put log footage and things like that, or even raw clips on my website, it's just overloaded the server because so many people just download it, and it does create issues. But I will try and see if we can sort that. So somebody's asking best all-round lens, and that's a really good question, but it's one that I don't have a really good answer for. And the reason I don't have a really good answer for it is it does depend on what you need. What do you shoot? What are you expecting from this camera? Now, being a full-frame sensor, zoom range is going to be restricted and limited. So you could use the Sony 28-135, and that would certainly be a very good choice. 28-135 f4 lens. It's a good zoom range, constant f4, parfocal lens. You can zoom in and out during the shot. You have that really nice focus ring with calibrated focus marks and everything else. It's a lovely, lovely lens to use, but it's bigger than the camera. So you know, it ends up being quite an odd and difficult camera to hold, because the way the hand grip is positioned, you know, back here, and you have this great big lens on the front, it's not very well balanced. Now, if you're going to build this camera up into a shoulder camera and put it on your shoulder with some sort of base plate or rig, then the 28-135 becomes a much more practical solution. This lens that I've got on here right now, this is Sony's 24-70 G Master lens, and this is a lovely, lovely lens. The image quality of this lens is absolutely gorgeous, and that's why it tends to be the lens that I have on my cameras most often. It's pretty expensive though, and 24-70 isn't a big zoom range. So the lens that perhaps, if there was just one lens and you could only ever have one lens currently, would be Sony's 24-105 f4. It's not quite parfocal, so if you try and zoom during your shot, the focus will shift a little bit. It's close, but it's not quite there. But it does give you that 24-105 mm zoom range, which is a pretty reasonable zoom range. It's fairly compact. It's about the same size as this lens. It's not huge, it's not bulky, it's not terribly expensive, and that would be a nice consideration as an all-round lens. But it's f4, so it's not particularly fast. But that is the trade-off when you go to a full-frame sensor. You're getting big zoom ranges and fast lenses at affordable prices is going to be challenging. It always will be, because it's just the laws of physics, laws of optics with full-frame. So that would probably be the one lens. If I was going to say this is the lens, it would be that one. Another lens that, yes.
835 mm, which comes with a FX9.
The which lens?
The 28-135 mm, the lens which comes with the FX9.
Yes, that's right. Yes, 28-135, which comes with the FX9. Yes, yeah. But it's bigger than this camera.
It is, but will it work proper with a zoom rocket?
Oh yeah, yes, absolutely, yes, yes, it works perfectly. It works fantastically on this camera. It's just very difficult to hold it. Because there's no grip on the lens, and it's all lens. You end up with this big lens in the front, but your hand grip is back here. So it's really hard to hold it up. It becomes quite awkward to use.
Yeah, and I don't think we have covered LCD screen regarding how is the quality of the LCD screen?
Yeah, no, we didn't cover that at all. So it is the same screen as the FX9. So it's a 1280p, a 720 by 1280 HD screen, high contrast. It's much better than the one that's on the FS7 and the FS5. It's significantly better than that screen. Focus magnification now works much better. It's really good. The image quality doesn't fall apart when you do the focus magnification. It comes with, I haven't got it on this camera, but it comes with a little flip up hood. I do have a PowerPoint slide somewhere that shows a picture of that.
The same screen as from the FX9.
Yes, it's exactly the same screen as the FX9, and it does come with a little flip-up hood, and this is actually quite effective because it's quite deep. So it folds flat, folds shut, and it does keep most of the sunlight off the screen. So it is actually quite effective. But your other option is you can buy the loop off the FX9, the actual eyepiece from the FX9, and it fits straight onto this screen. So if you do want that, yeah. So you can buy that if you want. In euros, I think it's about 600 euros ish, somewhere around there. Probably a little bit more actually, maybe 650 euros, something like that. It's not cheap, but you can buy it, and it does give you that. But you got to bear in mind this is a touch screen, and you may end up using that. So one of the touch screen features that I use a lot is the let me see if we can quickly show it. So one of the touchscreen features that I use a lot is the, if I go into the main menu for a minute, and I go back to my autofocus settings, is to use the flexible spot. And this is touchscreen, so I can just touch where I want the camera to focus. So it's focusing on the girl, then I can, it's perhaps not distinct enough. If I try my hand. So if I touch on my hand, it'll focus on my hand. If I touch on the background on the picture, it touches back there. So I can use, just by touching the LCD, I can do perfect pull focuses. And of course, if you've got the loop on the LCD screen, you can't do this. It's much harder to do. So it's one of the nice things about the camera. So even if you've got the loop, you very often end up with it flipped up so that you can use the touchscreen functions. Yeah.
And one other thing we have not covered is the memory stick. That you have options with two different memory cards to the camera.
Yes. Let me find. Yeah. So you've got dual slots on the camera, and they can take either SDXC or CF Express Type A. Now the Sony recommendation, this is what Sony recommend, is that if you want to shoot 4K 120, excuse me, I'm going to sneeze, I think. I'm going to sneeze, or is it going away? No, it's going away. For 4K or UHD 120 frames per second, they recommend CF Express Type A. Then Sony recommend that for XAVC-I in UHD and even XAVC-L in UHD and 4K, that you should use a V90 SD card. Now if you're only shooting HD, you can use, I'm going to sneeze, excuse me, sorry about that. If you're only shooting HD, you can use a V60 or in some cases a V30 SD card. Now, the camera won't prevent you from using incorrect media. So right now, this is why I'm getting if I just come out of the menu, if I take this card out of the camera and I put it back in, so this is actually this is a V60, and I put this in the camera, because I'm set to record in XAVC-I in UHD, it's giving me an unsupported media warning. I'll show you again. So we get a not guaranteed media. Now if I try and record on this, most of the time it will work. And the same if I try and do 120 frames per second, most of the time it will work. But if you start trying to record multiple clips or do any of the anything fancy, very quickly you can actually trip this up. And especially as the card fills up, what will happen is it will eventually, it will give it, because I've used this card a few times. I've just formatted it so it's quite good. But as I know with this particular card, that as it fills up, it becomes much slower, and you know, it will eventually give me an error, and when it gives you that error, it actually can be quite catastrophic. I know I can force it into an error by, if I go into S&Q now, try and record, it's definitely not going to work for very long in S&Q. And yeah, so the camera's just crashed actually by the looks of things. So I've got flashing record lights on the camera, and it's gone back to record again. That's, you know, I haven't seen it do that before. I've got flashing lights again. Now what I do find is that very often what happens when we get this situation where it isn't working properly, now we've got cannot proceed and media full. And this is the risk, this is the gamble. If you don't use the right media, when it goes wrong, you the card goes from being empty to full instantly, and you're going to lose footage. And it's up to you. If you want to take that risk by using the not recommended media, up to you. I really wouldn't do it, because you could be on a shoot and maybe you only lose the last clip. Maybe you don't lose everything that's on the card, but suddenly all your media is full. How do you then continue the shoot? How do you carry on from there when all your cards are suddenly going down to 0 space? Now what happens is, if I take the card out of the camera and put it back in, it will tell me to restore the card. And this is what you would have to do if this happens to you. You have to restore the card, and it can take a while to do it. So, oh, that was quick. Okay, it did it quite quickly. It's not something I would recommend, and I would stick with the Sony recommendation. So I would probably get 1 or 2 CF Express Type A cards. They are quite expensive to do your UHD 120 frames per second, and then some SD V90 cards to do everything else, because that will work for everything else, and you should be fine. And the V90s, they're not too expensive. They are, obviously, because they are the fastest SD cards, they are a bit more expensive, but it's not, we're not talking XQD card money. It's a lot cheaper than XQD cards.
And it's much more expensive to do the reshoot when it's half-page, so it's to have the right media, it's really important.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you're spending all of this money on the camera. I mean, I don't know if, you know, what facilities, you know, if people are buying a camera on a lease or finance or whatever, whether you can bundle in some media, and so the cost of that media is spread over the cost of your ownership of the camera. And of course, you don't have to buy all of your cards at once. Just you know, just pick up what you need initially, and then you can always add some more cards further down the road. Somebody commented recently, did they feel that CF Express cards would get much cheaper in the next 6 months or a year? And I don't think they will. I mean, XQD cards have never really got significantly cheaper. And I think because this is a sort of cutting edge media and it is very, very fast, it is harder to manufacture, that it will be a long time before the price comes down significantly.
Alister, we are, the time is flying, and it has been really interesting to hear your presentation and your experience for this short days you have had the camera, and I really enjoyed it. And I see a final question which is quite valid, and it's delivery time. When will the lovely small baby be available in Sweden and Norway? And Sony has told us that in the beginning of December they will try to start to deliver, but we don't know the amount of cameras we will receive. So I really urge urge you to place an order with us, so you get in queue, so you get the camera in proper time. So, but Alister, thank you very much for this presentation and your experience with it. And if you have questions about the product, prices, finance, as you said, Alister, please I'll use our details here with provideo@scandinavianphoto.se or salg@scandinavianphoto.no in Norway. So there you have the addresses in written also.
Yeah, I'll just add something to this, Johnny. Is I know it's very tempting for a lot of people to go online and surf around to try and find the best price that they can get from some online only store or whatever. I really do urge people to buy from a store, to buy from a dealer where you can actually go and talk to the people in person and face to face. Because the guys at Scandinavian Photo, you guys really know your stuff. You do know what you're talking about. And by building that relationship with the store, with the dealer, and it is rare, but if something goes wrong or if you need a bit of extra support, they're going to be able to help you. If you buy from some anonymous website or whatever, yeah, the product will be fine, but if something then goes wrong or you need some help, you're not going to get the same level of support. So do talk to the guys at Scandinavian Photo. They're great guys to work with, great guys to speak to, and go to the stores, meet them, greet them, because they're just good people to work with.
I appreciate those words, Alister. And also contact us. We will have a demo camera very soon. And I will try to go around to the stores and meet you. We do private meetings, and so we can test the camera yourself. So please contact us, and we will do our best to provide a good product and good service to you. Once again, Alister, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
For this presentation. And to everyone, have a really nice weekend and stay healthy in these days. Thank you very much.